Hey, everybody, welcome to the Hot Pursuit podcast brought to you by LeadPost. Maximize the ROI of your marketing campaigns by identifying your anonymous website visitors who don't convert with LeadPost. Get a free trial at leadpost.com. I'm Roy Harmon, and today I'm very excited to be talking to Jon Farah, founder of PBLC, which is a life marketing automation agency for B2B SaaS companies. Just off the bat, first thing I would like to say is you have a great looking website.
Thanks, Roy. I appreciate it. I'm really excited to be on, and I'm excited about the conversations that we had over the past months and weeks, as well as we've connected. And I've got the opportunity to learn what you all are up to at LeadPost and the clients that you're working with.
Yeah, well, and could you tell people a little bit more about your background? Because you're very well suited to talk about this topic, and I think it'd be great for people to kind of know where you're coming from.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. My background is, of course, in marketing. I've worked in the big agency world for almost a decade now, working with Fortune 100, Fortune 50 brands, specifically in B2B, some telecom and software as well. And ultimately, what I've learned in those years of working in big agency settings with these Fortune companies is there's a lot of things that those large organizations do across a life cycle in B2B that smaller organizations can apply as well. Specifically creating messaging and content that's relevant for the customer's life cycle stage. So that's what we do at PBLC. We create lifecycle marketing automation strategies for B2B software companies that can ultimately progress their prospects from one stage to the next and their users from early user to ultimately high LTV super user.
And so, can you talk to us? And I don't know if I mentioned, but the topic for today is life cycle marketing. Maybe I'll cut this part out and move it. So talk to us a little bit about what you mean by that. Are you talking primarily just about the customer journey and making sure that you're really being intentional about those, how you approach those touch points along the journey?
Yeah, exactly, Roy. So the customer's journey is really the primary building block to building a great lifecycle strategy from a marketing perspective. Because ultimately what we want to do, and this is across any marketing that we want to do, is we want to understand at which stage of the journey is each customer at any given time. So then we can reactively or proactively deliver marketing communications via like email, SMS, seller engagements, right, that are going to progress a customer across that journey. So for example, in B2B, right, we love talking about pipeline. And if a lead has landed at the top of our pipeline, we're going to speak differently to them than we are someone who is in the consideration phases, has already had a demo with the seller, and is deciding between one product or another, right? So identifying that journey is instrumental to building marketing content that's going to speak appropriately to each customer at each stage and ultimately progress them to purchase or whatever the goal outcome is of an individual stage.
So you've got two primary variables, it sounds like, where the one is who are you talking to, and the other is when are you talking to them. And I know that there's a lot of people who have a lot of different ways of creating these buyer personas, breaking up the funnel, but how do you do it?
Yeah. So we look at two primary buckets because we do full life cycle marketing automation strategy. So we're looking at someone from when they first become aware of a brand all the way through to becoming that super user. Holistically, we look at two separate categories. We have pre-purchase and we have post-purchase. So that's very much so to simplify how we're looking at and how we're communicating with customers versus users. Again, I kind of talk more software because that's the space I work in. So pre-purchase, we're thinking about lifecycle and marketing automation differently than we would post-purchase, because ultimately in pre-purchase, we're driving towards outcomes like demo bookings and purchases. Whereas post-purchase, we're looking at user onboarding, super user lifetime value, and ultimately on-platform engagements, right? So we're working towards separate KPIs in those two categories So we kind of bucket in that way so that we can make things a little bit more digestible, more so outcome oriented.
And how many personas do you typically come up with when you're deciding on that element? Is there any amount that's too many? Uh, how do you go about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Roy. And it's a conversation that we have with a lot of clients when we're onboarding with them. I'd like for this instance to speak to folks that are just getting started. They have their scenario, maybe they originally bootstrapped, now they're doing like 1 to 5 million ARR and they have a robust team. And ultimately, they're looking to augment some of the manual. And what we get the opportunity to work through some things that may be unknown initially, right? Like, where do we want to potentially A/B test? How can we create optimizations? How can we enhance, right? And once we have that full ICP launched, then we have the ability to more or less repeat across the other ICPs, knowing that we have a successful framework in place already. So ultimately, we can scale, like some of the clients that we work with are working across like 5 ICPs because they have a lot of different, they have inputs and outputs from a customer perspective who are collaborating on their platform. But the strongest recommendation there is starting with one and then iterating.
That makes a lot of sense. Basically you keep it simple to kind of build out those touch points and figure out what the journey looks like before you start trying to say, okay, we got Sally, the CEO, and Bobby, the branch manager, and just all that. What about do you find that the way that you divide up the customer journey when it comes to B2B SaaS, is it pretty much the same? You're always going to see the same stages, or how much does that vary from client to client?
It's so cool, like the tools that we have available to us today, because we should have 0 customers that have the same journey as another. So all of our lifecycle marketing automations should be, and this is where we focus, is based on action or inaction, right? So for example, if we have 5 stages across the pre-purchase journey, we should ultimately aim to progress each prospect from one stage to the next. And when they do, at that time, we will enroll them in the next automation campaign. And for folks that don't, they are inactive, right? They do not take our goal action. We will communicate personalized content to them to ultimately drive them toward taking that action. So every prospect is on their own journey through the pipeline, and we have the opportunity to personalize content based on what they do or don't do. So I know you're asking like, hey, what is one journey versus the versus for one prospect versus the journey for another prospect? Is they are all absolutely different. And what we really need to do is trigger content based on action or inaction, and then within that content, create personalization so that it's hyper relevant for the individual that we're speaking to.
So the idea is, since not all people are going to make the journey in a linear fashion, some people are going to maybe skip around, or some people are just going to come in and they're ahead of the game. Maybe they were talking to somebody else, or who knows. So by using these event-based triggers, you're able to say, okay, well, I know if they're doing this, regardless of whatever else they've done or what they've looked at on my page, these triggers let me know that they're probably ready for this.
Yeah, exactly. One campaign example, Roy, that I'm a huge fan of, it's called a recapture automation. So what we do is once the sales team marks a lead as cold lost or just lost or no response, right? So these are inactive prospects. We will wait 2 months and then enroll them in an automation that essentially says, hey, you may have been tasting one of our competitors. You may have ultimately put this on the back burner and not land on a solution at all. We'd like to reintroduce ourselves, right? And we're going to speak to that person very, very different than we would someone that's like in the middle of our pipeline. We're trying to get them into a demo call with a sales team, right? So that's a perfect example of how each journey is unique, and ultimately we need to account for those and create content that's hyper relevant for where each person is in their journey, or if they dropped out of our journey and we're trying to get them back in.
Okay, so can you walk us through sort of the kind of somebody who starts off, let's say, at the top of the funnel, so to speak, and can you walk us through what the automations might look like as that person moved through, and what triggers you might use to decide where they are?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, without getting too far in the weeds, because we could talk about this for a couple hours. I think ultimately, as we look at our vertical funnel, right, in a pipeline format, the best way to think about marketing automation strategy, lifecycle strategy, is we see this funnel as a bucket, right? And ultimately, our leads are water coming into the bucket. And our job is to fill any holes that may exist in that bucket, because the more water that flows out, the more money, opportunity, and prospects that flow out as well, right? Because our water is our prospects. So as we look at the funnel, we're aiming to fill some of those gaps that may exist. And then we're ultimately looking to make sure as much of that water lands in the bottom of the bucket as possible. So at the top of the funnel, we are not asking for anything. We are primarily informing, educating, and sharing content of value in more of a welcome / onboarding sequence that we are going to enroll new leads in, whether they come from a tool like LeadPost, whether they come from paid media, organic or otherwise, or cold outreach as well. So top of funnel, we're very much so focused on, I know we were talking about KLT before we started recording, know, like, and trust. So we're aiming to build some of that rapport. We're aiming to build some of that trust, top of funnel. Middle of funnel, we're getting a little bit closer to the ask, right? And we're those leads that engage with top of funnel content, we're progressing them to middle of funnel. And we're ultimately doing things that are a little bit more close to that ask, right? We're making clear value propositions. We're creating problem solution alignment. We're showing proof of results. We're potentially doing some competitor analysis and comparison. And then bottom of funnel, we're then triggering automation content that is going to drive to our goal outcome. For a lot of the work that we do, it's demo bookings. To ultimately get prospects in front of sellers. And then some of that follow up as well after that meeting to ultimately aim to convert into a purchase. So that's primarily what we're looking at, and some of the triggers that we would use to enroll folks as they land at the bottom of our bucket and getting as much of that water down to the bottom as possible.
And what about, so a lot of people, when we think about lead nurturing, we're thinking about, okay, you're pouring the leads into the funnel and then some of them are going to come out. And I think that a lot of us think about lead nurturing as kind of keeping them in the funnel. And I know that in that example, that's how you were talking about it. But you've also talked about how you can use lead nurturing to actually increase sales velocity. I think that a lot of people don't necessarily think about that fact that as you are establishing this relationship and giving people this information, the kind of information you give them can sometimes help them understand maybe they need to speed this up, or this is costing us money. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the work that we do is very much so integrated with the sales org, right? And there needs to be value in the work for that team. And the best way to simplify increasing sales velocity via the marketing automation content is asking the sales team, would you rather, in a 30-minute demo call, spend 25 minutes explaining the tool and its value, 5 minutes actually understanding what the customer needs, right? Spend most of the time educating the customer? Or would you rather the customer show up, the prospect show up, informed, educated, and ready with questions, right? So that you can actually problem solve for them versus just like having a canned presentation and canned explanations and whatnot. We would always choose the latter, right? Because we want prospects who have valuable questions during the selling process and understand and know the offering. So that's a primary value as far as like sales velocity, because ultimately sales velocity is measuring a variety of different micro outcomes that lead to macro success. So the automations will make micro impacts to each of those categories. For example, it'll speed the 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 time to sale, right? Because we have informed and educated prospects versus uninformed prospects who need all of that manual education from the sales team, and ultimately drive to our goal outcomes, which is more closed deals in a short period of time.
And everything's more efficient because you've got it automated. That's one of the big things that is so great about the time we're living in for people in sales and marketing. You can automate sales sequences, automate workflows,
Yeah.
and not only that, but then, like you mentioned before, they know, they like, and they trust you and have better feelings about your brand. What you're saying about people showing up and understanding the product or the service, in your case, usually the product, the software, it really resonates with me just because I've been in so many situations as a marketer where I'm talking to somebody, just maybe it's my mom and I'm explaining to her, it's like, oh, well, this is what we do. And even just in those, when you're first trying to get somebody to understand, you've got that curse of knowledge where to you, it's like, yeah, no, it's this, of course. But once you start talking to people about it, like your sales team's going to do, you're going to find out, okay, we all thought that this made total sense. Marketing told us that it was genius. Unfortunately, these are the questions we're getting. And now marketing, as long as you're closing the loop, marketing can go back and say, okay, well, let's change this because maybe some of that stuff Roy sent over wasn't as genius as we thought.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly where our opportunity lies in partnership with the sales team. And right, I think we should also talk about how this could negatively impact the sales process,
Oh
right?
yeah, definitely.
Because on the flip side of what we just talked about, if you're implementing marketing automations that, one, don't consider the qualitative inputs from the sales team, by starting off the engagement by saying, hey, what's the confusion? What are the misconceptions that prospects have when they arrive at a conversation with you? So we can address those in content. So if we don't do that, and we don't create any alignment with the sales team, so they have no idea what sort of content is landing with their prospects before their conversation, then we're essentially going to blow up sales velocity. We're going to move backwards. So I think that you can also miss pretty big with this and have a negative impact, but the opportunities to have a positive impact are very significant.
And I think that everybody, at least in the beginning of their marketing career, can probably remember a time
Yeah.
when they tried to set up some campaign or something without telling somebody in sales, and they're like, "Why are people asking me for this? What is this?"
Yeah.
What so what about delivery?
Mhm.
You're we know when we want to get people these pieces of information. Obviously, wherever we can, an omni-channel approach is great. But what are you doing to make sure that you're able to contact these people? Are you gating content? How are you getting that, whether it's a cookie or something else, that first event to where you can start saying, okay, here's the trigger to send this, here's the trigger to send that. How are you delivering this message?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question, Roy. I think for the work that we're doing with B2B software companies, we're primarily looking at email, right? Because SMS just feels weird, like to receive a text from a company in a B2B setting is a little odd. So we're primarily looking at email across the life cycle journey. Now, as we're looking at lead acquisition, we work with some awesome lead gen partners who drive a majority of that top of funnel acquisition. And then we ultimately engage with those leads and ultimately users once they do enter our pipeline. However, I think if there's one thesis and the most important nugget I've received from those awesome partners that we do work with for top of funnel lead gen, it's providing content of value. right? Because ultimately that's what we're aiming to do in our life cycle journey content as well. So if we can get leads into the pipeline who have already received value, we have more opportunity to have a mutually beneficial relationship across marketing and sales with those prospects. So oftentimes it's like, hey, how many leads can we get in for the right reason, right? For example, for leads that come in through a platform like Lead Post, it's all about providing value, offering your time initially, right, to have some conversations that may not have a hard ask built within them. So offering opportunities of value to ultimately get them into the pipeline under the right pretext.
Would you say that is it enough just to have a conversation with sales, or how intentional and how thorough do you need to be in that process of aligning the sales and marketing teams? What are you doing to make sure that everybody's on the same page?
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, I think that for this work, for full life cycle marketing automation, I think as we're looking at pre-purchase specifically, like sales alignment is 90% of the deal, right? The other 10 is creating the content, making sure that we have the right strategy, triggering and engage and enrolling leads at the right time. But ultimately, like we talked about before, it can either positively or negatively impact something like sales velocity. And the more alignment that we have with the seller's process, the better. Now, as we're looking at post-purchase, that's completely different, right? That's more so about how do we look at onboarding new users to the platform? How do we look at embedding our tool in how they do business? I like to also talk a little bit about organizational penetration, like how do we get users across our customers' organization to engage with the tool so that it's very much so embedded in the way that their whole organization operates. And then as we look at that super user category, how are we creating the most LTV possible? And how are we also gathering like user feedback so we can enhance and optimize the tool as well? So I think as we're looking at pre-purchase, to answer your question, pre-purchase, it's all about sales alignment. Post-purchase, it's more so aligning with the product team, aligning with the customer success team, and understanding which of our super users do we want to like, how did they get there, and how can we recreate that for other users?
So can you talk to us about a specific campaign that you've worked on and just walk us through it and tell us how that looks?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk a little bit about a health tech client that we work with. The product is very much so focused on connecting non-emergent transportation companies to nursing facilities. So just like briefly, a little like elevator pitch for the product, explaining what it does is, let's say, Roy, you run a nursing facility, you have 300 patients, and any given day, somewhere between 20 and 30 of those patients will need to be relocated to a different facility and or arrive at your facility via certified transportation. It's called non-emergent transportation. All like the industry right now is like fax and phone call based to organize those rides. So the platform is a digital marketplace to acquire those rides for the patients that need to either leave or be relocated to your facility. So the platform itself has multiple users, right? Because it's kind of like the Uber, just to simplify, the kind of Uberish of healthcare transportation. So there are the facilities that need the services, and there are the service providers, which are the ride providers. And there's a few other like ICPs as well, like large hospital systems are going to be very much so a different ICP than like a single location nursing facility. And same thing on the non-emergent transportation, like large ambulance companies are going to be very much so different than like a single service provider. So we have worked across the full life cycle. In pre-purchase, we're looking to convert as many top of funnel leads that largely arrive via paid media into book demo calls for the sales team. Now, what's interesting about the business model for this platform is they make revenue on the actual rides. that take place, right? So pre-purchase, we very much so want to get as many users from our target ICPs onto the platform. So we're using HubSpot workflow automations to do that. But where it gets really interesting from a revenue perspective is post-purchase, because again, like they only make revenue when folks use the platform to book and execute rides. We're using Customer IO to ultimately onboard users from all of the ICP categories and encourage them to use the baseline features of the tool to become more familiar with it, and then drive them to actually execute the revenue driving activity, which is booking and fulfilling rides. And we've also looked at the kind of super user category as well, and modeled our progression and automated content based on how we want as many users to arrive at that level as possible. And we've seen a ton of success on both sides. Pre-purchase, we're looking at like 30 to 40% of new leads are actually booking a demo call with the sales team. And then post-purchase, we're seeing a ton of engagement with the automation content coming out of Customer IO that's ultimately leading to on-platform usage.
What's the minimum as far as software and tools that somebody would need to start down that road and to be putting together campaigns like that for their own company?
Yeah. So my biggest recommendation is avoid tool complexity. I think like oftentimes when you like go online and Google, like what's the tech stack to do XYZ, you're going to get the first article result that is like, hey, you need to get this tool, and then you need to run a zap to that tool, and then make sure that they're communicating back and forth. So do this and that. And then by the way, you have to do like manual entries as well. I see you like laughing.
And before that, they're going to tell you what all these things are. What is a CRM?
Yeah.
Well, it's something on your computer, but what is a computer? Gotta get all those related keywords in for SEO.
Roy, it almost reminds me of every time I look up a recipe online, and
Yeah.
it
I was just using that. I've got another episode that's coming out. I was using that example because I look up, I mean, something simple. I was looking up, how can I cook some hot dogs in the oven? To me, that seems pretty simple. And in fact, it is. It's just, they say, cut it down the center, throw it on a pan, leave it in for 15 minutes, and that's it. But first, I'm reading about like the history of the hot dog, what goes into a hot dog. Nobody wants to know that. It's a mess, but who knows where we're going to end up with all the things that AI is potentially going to do to SEO. Have you seen any cool uses of AI or machine learning that is helpful on the lifecycle marketing side?
Yeah, and I'm pumped to talk about that, but I do want to answer your question about like where to start, right? So let's put ourselves in the shoes of someone who's potentially listening to this. They just joined a startup. I know we talked earlier. The startup is just transitioning from bootstrapping into having a more robust team and process. So they're doing something like 1 to 5 million ARR. Now, what should that person start with? They're like the only marketer, or they're on the sales team, and the CEO is like, hey, we need to make sure that we're communicating with prospects when they enter our funnel. Start with one campaign where, once using the CRM, so don't reinvent the wheel and get 10 tools working for this. Use the CRM, and each CRM today, if they're at all competitive, has some sort of automation tool where once a prospect lands in the CRM via any campaign, start with informing, educating, and providing value in like 4 or 5 emails. Simple as that, because ultimately we want to start by solving for one goal outcome. That number one goal outcome should be delivering informed and educated leads to the sales team. And then from there, we can look at more robust things like, hey, what do we do bottom of funnel? And how do we potentially follow up with some of those leads that had gone cold? And that's our leaky bucket analogy.
What do you think about AI? Is that something that you've found to be helpful? Is it sort of just a distraction? How does that come into play when it comes to lifecycle marketing automation?
I was actually recently talking about this with an agency partner of mine, about the reality of the landscape has changed a little bit. However, what still exists is those best able to leverage tools will always be ahead, right? The first person to run Google Ads, like early search engine, they were crushing it, right? And the first person to send emails, marketing emails, they have like 98% open rates, 75% click-through rates and whatnot, right? So I think as marketers, holistically, we should be familiar with and we should leverage the tools however we best can. I think right now, like the state of the tools is used in my opinion, for like defeating creative block or writer's block and using the tools to help us expand upon messages and information that we're aiming to organize and exist more as editors, right? In refining and optimizing content and adding like a human touch to it as well. I will send this to you, Roy, but I also have a guide on how to use ChatGPT to build your marketing automation strategy.
Oh, great.
For
Yeah.
repurpose. Yeah, so I think it's another tool that folks can use who are just wanting to get started and not sure exactly where to start. Is it's a very long prompt, like page long prompt that will output a relatively solid strategy that looks across the pipeline to create automation. So I think like that's a perfect example. Ultimately, is it going to do the work for us? No, not right now. Should it do the work for us? Probably not. Can it help us get past some of those blockers along our journey, get through some of those speed bumps? Yeah, absolutely.
That seems to be the case to me as well. I have not had any, I feel like I've had very minimal success with it on the actual writing style as far as getting something that's going to be ready for prime time.
Yeah,
But it's so much nicer to be able to just say, it's you just don't start with a blank page,
right.
even if it's something like I remember I used to manage 20 writers, and they would be submitting stuff to me all the time. And when you're working with that many and we were doing like an article a day, 2,000 words, so it's a lot of stuff. And some of these people were not the best writers in the world because I was on a tight budget. And I remember getting things where I would just have to start over from scratch and pull
Mm,
in
yeah,
new, I would have to pull in new like sources. I would read the source and I'd be like, what? They don't even say what you said. That's not even in
right,
here.
right.
And ChatGPT, though, it's kind of like that, where, first of all, I have no false sense of security because I've seen how much it can mess up. I would never trust it to get a source right or a fact right. So I'm always double checking.
Mhm.
Um, but that said, it's still a lot better, in my opinion. I prefer that to just looking at a blank page. It's much easier for me to be like, okay, I'm gonna take this out, even if it looks totally nothing like what it did in the beginning. It's just nice not to be looking at that blank page.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Like helping get through those initial steps and like any sort of creative endeavor is super helpful. I think like some of the more like analog data entry type things that we do, I think we can absolutely hand that over to AI and help them just get things done that are very process oriented. But I think for some of the gray area things, it's a good tool, but not necessarily the solution yet.
Yeah, one trick that I found that I like as far as getting more natural writing is I do a lot of free writing where
Mhm.
you sit down, you type for however long, you don't look, you don't let yourself stop,
Yeah,
and then at the end you just have this big mess, but it's got some ideas in it. And I'll actually think about my problem, type everything out, the article, the topic, whatever, then feed that into ChatGPT and be like, organize this for me.
right.
And then I can take that and do a little more with it. So that's another way to get past that blank page.
I like it.
I I am really I this has been a great episode, and I hope that you will come back because I feel like we
Absolutely.
have barely scratched the surface, but some great insights. Could you tell us before you go, a little bit more about your agency and how you work and the kind of companies that you work with.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So at pblc, we do full life cycle marketing automation. We cover those two categories that we had talked about, pre-purchase and post-purchase. We're primarily focused on delivering strategies to companies that they can implement themselves. And the companies that we do work with, we very much so work with B2B companies that exist in the software, SaaS, and tech spaces. That's where our expertise exists and thrives the best. And then as far as like learning more about what we're up to, we were just talking earlier about daily posting on LinkedIn. So feel free to find me on LinkedIn at Jon Farah, where very much so focused on like a lot of the topics that we talked about today. We're delivering content that's going to be easy to follow for folks that are just getting started, and going a little bit more in the weeds on things that folks that are further along the journey would potentially need to improve the automations that they've implemented.
Yeah, and another thing, if anybody is interested in working with Jon, if you go to pblcmedia.com, he's got a great FAQ page that was one of the most useful ones I found in terms of actually answering questions that I'm wondering about. And he's even got some basic pricing information. So you really come away from it with a pretty good idea of what to expect. So I would definitely recommend that people check that out and follow you. I am following you, and I'm looking forward to talking more on LinkedIn and hopefully on another episode.
Thanks, Mariah. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed our chat today, and pumped to stay in touch and again.
Thanks.